Dear viewers, Assalamu alaikum. I'm your host Faisal Raza Khan and you are watching Foresight. Viewers, just recently, Asian Development Bank issued Asia Pacific Climate Report 2024, which explained horrible consequences of greenhouse gas emissions, global warming and resultantly the climatic changes. Report explains that by 2070, Pakistan's gross domestic product, GDP, could cut by 21.1% and by the end of this century, it would be further decline to 41%. Economic losses to climate dependent sectors will be 2.1% to the GDP and to labor productivity loss due to heat waves and intense climatic and weather patterns will be 10.4% to the GDP by 2070. Just imagine the catastrophic 2022 floods that had inflicted an enormous amount of losses to the economy. It was estimated that approximately 30 billion US dollars losses were inflicted because of the floods, and those were 8 to 10% loss to the GDP. At least 33 million people affected, more than 1,700 people lost their lives, and there was an unprecedented destruction as at least 1/3 of the country was underwater. Balochistan and Sindh were the main losers. And still, after 2 years, most of the areas and most of the population still struggling to get out of that acute trauma. Now, Pakistan got another opportunity. As Pakistan placed its case in COP 27, the Conference of Party, that was the 27th session, in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, and Pakistan placed loss and damage with the assistance of G77 plus China, and that was approved. Then afterwards, in COP 28 in UAE, that was operationalized, and the mechanism to devise the real-time structure of loss and damage was devised. Then again, now there is a continued hope, not only from Pakistan, but lots of developing countries, that this loss and damage fund will be realized and fully operationalized under World Bank. And also, there is a hope that adaptation fund would also be energized and resources would be provided by the developed countries. The Green Climate Fund and all other related issues which are the collective issues of humanity, those will be dealt with care and realization that the developing world or the global south is suffering because of the developed world industrialization. Now, the 29th Conference of Party, or which we call COP 29, is going to be held under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, in Baku, Azerbaijan, from 11th of November to 22nd of November 2024. Pakistan is going to participate in this important COP 29 at the highest level, as the Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif is going to visit Baku, Azerbaijan at the invitation of Azerbaijani President Ilham Aliyev. He will not only have a bilateral and the delegation level talks during this important visit, but also there would be sideline meetings with the head of states, head of governments and all other who are important at this COP, because Pakistan will use the climate diplomacy to place its issues and problems pertaining to the climatic changes. How much it is important, that is very important question for Pakistan actually. Now, to discuss this very important and grave issue concerning Pakistan, we have in our studios Dr. Ejaz Ahmad. He is the senior environmentalist and the former director of Worldwide Fund for Nature Pakistan. He is here. Thank you very much, Dr. Ejaz, for your presence. And with him, Mr. Talha Tufail Bhatti. He is the climate change researcher at the Institute of Regional Studies, IRS, Islamabad. Most welcome to you. Thank you very much, Talha. And online joining us is Zainab Naeem. She is the research fellow at Sustainable Development Policy Institute, SDPI. She will join us in a moment. So my first question to you, Dr. Ejaz, that COP29 Azerbaijan is considered as the finance COP or the COP of action to fill the key financial gaps, achieving the agreed objectives of the Paris Agreement and shape up the concrete decisions taken during the COP28 UAE to help the vulnerable countries combating climate change. Whether this climate troika, which is based upon the United Arab Emirates, the Azerbaijan and the Brazil, where the COP30 will be held. So how they will ensure to convince those developed countries to realize their responsibilities, the climate responsibilities, and have the climate financing for the developing countries?
I think, first of all, I would like to thank you for having me on this discussion. I personally feel that the mechanism for loss and damage has still in the process of development. Although they have identified the manager for the fund, World Bank is going to execute and manage this fund. But still, I think the procedural components are missing, and they will be adopted. They will be developed during this COP, and maybe by 2025 we will be in a position to initiate some of the interventions or support some of the interventions through this fund. So maybe it will take a little bit more time. But I think mostly decisions in such gathering, in such event and conferences are taken not by 2 or 3 people.
Definitely.
It is consultative process in which many, like head of the countries, they will be participating and come up with certain positive solutions which are required. These 3 important people, they can of course recommend certain policy guidelines, they can suggest certain things, but I think we should wait for another COP in order to channelize the resources.
Definitely, your point well taken. Talha, why developed world is still reluctant to contribute? So in absence of the developed world contributions, how discussions get successful, meaningful and result oriented, especially regarding the funding on nationally determined contributions and the new climate quantified goals, NCQG, to replace the previous pledge of $100 billion. UN evaluated that Global South annual need around $500 billion climate finance, and US based think tank World Resource Institute and the African countries think that it's above $1 trillion annually. But aid, not the loans to the vulnerable countries. So how do you see that?
Well, I must say a very impressive question, and thank you for having me on the show. The developed world is very concerned about the emissions which happened in the last 30 years. And they usually say this: we only fund you if you ask the other developing nations like China to finance the climate finance into the broader spectrum of the donors. Like we usually say that the climate change is a historic responsibility of Western nations, like the EU and the US. They are the historic emitters. But if you see the timeline of the emissions, whatever emission in the last 30 years is equivalent to 48% of the emissions in the last 180 years. So the last 40 years last 30 years was dominated by the China, and the China emitted a large amount of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So they are saying this: if you don't add those recent emitters, in which Saudi Arabia is one of them, China is one of them, and all producing countries which we developed in the last 30 years, which developed in the last 30 years, they say to increase the benchmark of it. So that is why they are very reluctant into this. But on the other side, if you look at the EM data reports, they told you about in the last year we have around 399 natural disasters. Pakistan faced 13 natural disasters in 2023, sir. We remember the flood of 2022, but we faced 13 natural disasters in 2023. So the bill is actually increasing, and the number is now in trillions, as you have mentioned. I feel the same manner, because $1 trillion is compatibly enough for the developed and the developing world to mitigate from those or to adapt to those realities which are very new to us right now. We don't know where we are, and if you look at the scientific background, the averages which we took to model ourselves into a projection are not very reliable now, because the anomalies are very frequent into in every year, and they are increasing in a manner of like big and way beyond than we actually expect. And the major fact which scientific community actually believes it's very alarming is the rapidness of the change. Like with every increment now, the reaction is non-linear, that it will increase multiple folds if we increase 1 degree centigrade temperature.
Obviously.
So that is the reason, that is the reason the agency is here, because we don't know what to do and where we are and how we going to move forward. The only thing which we feel can save us is the finance facilities which are present internationally. And the developed world, specifically the US and the EU, are very reluctant to finance those things. If we look about the China actually contributed into around $31 billion through BRI into the climate finance, and they annually donate around $4 billion into this. But US is saying to increase that worth of financing.
Yeah, definitely, because they are committing.
That is the
they are committing a lot, but without action. Basically, this is unfortunate. Dr. Ejaz, recently, the Loss and Damage Fund mechanism meeting was held on September 18th to 20th in Baku, Azerbaijan. Reaches a historical milestone by setting the stage for the first disbursement by 2025. Operationalization with rules and regulations, eligibility criteria for funding, funding access, application procedures and other methodologies, along with electing the fund executive director to sign an agreement and manage fund effectively under the World Bank supervision. But a question still remains that how fund will be resourced. Because this is very important. If you don't have the resource and the structure is available. So for what that is basically.
But I think this one thing which happened very recently on 1st of November, the executive director has joined a guy from Senegal. He has joined the fund, and I think it is a very important time because before COP he has already taken over this and he will be in a position to understand the mechanism. And also I was going through his CV, he has a lot of background banking and all the especially climate change related initiatives.
He is kind of a climate corporate guy.
Exactly.
Okay.
So I think of course it will be a challenge to getting the resource because as mentioned by Talha that this is something which is still not recognized by the developed countries. They don't want to actually put in that kind of resources, and so far only I think less than $1 billion have been generated. So it is a big
Initially
challenge.
it was $790 million dollars were pledged in COP28, but unfortunately what left is around $700 million.
Approximately, yes.
Approximately,
720 or something. So it is going to be a challenge, and then as like with the passage of time, the requirement is increasing because all the issues are enhancing, they are multiplying. Similarly, disasters are also increasing with the passage of time. So the need is more and more with the passage of time. Whereas the contribution from the developed countries are not coming to that level. So I think it is going to be a challenge, but this COP is very important. Looking at the the response from this country, will be in a position to understand. And one thing which happened today, Trump is back.
Definitely,
So,
definitely. Whole of the world is actually looking at this because he is the one who was got out of the Paris Agreement. And he is not much supporter of the climatic changes and all that.
So there is a big challenge also.
Definitely, definitely. It is the big challenge, but still the Biden administration is there because he is going to take office next year. So let's see. So Talha, do you not think that at the national level there should be an effective mechanism needed with a strategic plan with need-based approaches, some sort of project proposals, its monitoring and evaluation process, a task force on the climate finance, adaptation, mitigation, policy development, and gender-specific and responsive actions inclusive of all stakeholders, and with an oversight body for wise implementation of these loss and damage funds or any other climate financial resources of the National Adaptation Plan 2023. Do you think under that we can do, or we require something to have oversight? Because you know that it is important that when this loss and damage fund or the adaptation fund or something like that will be materialized, we should be very much ready and geared up to accept that funding and to utilize it properly.
Well, I feel like there is already multiple authorities and institutions which are in place to capitalize those funds if they are released. But you have to understand this, you are not the only vulnerable country in the world right now.
Obviously.
And there is a lot more which are more vulnerable than you, and there are a lot more which are the least developed countries.
But Pakistan is among those
Top,
countries,
yeah,
those top countries who are most vulnerable, and our contribution is fractionally to 1%. So the thing is that we require that funding at first. No doubt that other countries are also, and we are pleading the case of all other developing countries as well. This is not only Pakistan at COP.
Hey, at COP there are alliances in the blue
Obviously,
zone.
that's
And
why we are there with G77 plus China.
Exactly. Yeah. There are alliances, and in those alliances we promote certain ideas on high priority and the low priority.
Obviously.
And in this COP, the main focus is centered towards to this Article 6.2 to 6.4.
Yes.
Specifically.
You are talking about Paris Agreement.
Paris Agreement. But if at the local level, I think we have enough of the institutions and legislative work present. All we need to do is implement those things. What I feel like after 18 amendment, there is a gap between the federal and the provincial authorities, and the provincial authorities can transfer those powers to the district levels, and there are institutional mechanisms like DDMs, district disaster management authorities, chaired by the DC of that district. That body is not active for I don't know what are the reasons, but if that body can be active, we can harvest all those things which you just
Talha,
mentioned.
there is another problem. Most of the experts say that Ministry of Climate Change has lots of things in their ambit, but the problem is that most of the other issues like agriculture, like livestock, like commerce, like industry, because if you want to implement all those green industry initiatives and all others, you require most of the ministries, focal persons, or the ministries on board. So that is also needed when we are talking about it. That's why an oversight body must have to be there.
So the oversight body, I'm talking about if you look at the NDCs which we placed in the back in 2021, those NDCs are the pledge from the national side.
Obviously.
And we actually, if you look at the energy side, we already achieved 52% of the renewable energy into the national grid. So that actually addition is justifying that our target could be mettable by 2060. We can achieve 60%.
Obviously. Also,
I would like to just add that now this climate change authority has already been formed.
Yes.
The people have started, like recruitment, the process has started. There are already people in place who are doing that. But I think this is very important point that you mentioned, because we actually lost many opportunities.
Yes.
CDM mechanism was there, and just because we did not have that capacity, we were unable to actually tap that.
Carbon development mechanism was a real chance for Pakistan to earn billions of dollars.
Exactly.
But unfortunately, we lost that opportunity.
That is, I think, the need of the day.
Definitely.
To have certain body which can actually train people, and then ultimately look for such proposals which are
even some of the projects we won regarding Red Plus and all that, but unfortunately we lost that opportunity as well.
Yes.
So there are gaps and we have to fill it. Zainab, most welcome to you. Thank you very much for sparing time to be online. What about adoption of adaptation global goals till 2030 as the COP28 urged countries to have adaptation plans in place by 2030. How much we are ready by this mechanism particularly? UN and the different experts intends to have ambitious targets to achieve, but UN owns an intergovernmental panel on climate change, IPCC, estimated that only 7% of the total climate finance gone to adaptation over the period of some years, as compared to the 60% promised by the developed countries till 2022, and that already those promises are lapsed?
Thank you, Faisal, and apologies for not joining you in the studio. Well, I think we've been having these kind of discussions throughout because now COP is just around the corner. I think you have partly answered the question yourself. The developed countries are not willing to finance the developing countries, no matter what we do. This has been happening since Kyoto Protocol, and this will continue to happen no matter what the situation becomes. And now, partly they are also justified that climate change is no longer limited to the developing countries only. It's now coming to their own houses. Just look into what's happening in Spain nowadays, what's happening in Europe. So, as far as adaptation goals are concerned, yes, we have to develop our adaptation plans, and Pakistan did develop its national adaptation plan. But I think we are mostly focusing around, okay, we have ratified that convention and now we have to do this and that, because on next COP we have to report it. But we're not focusing on the ground realities, and that's why the implementation mechanism is missing. For example, as part of the national adaptation plan, we have to develop provincial adaptation plans, and then we have to develop a national financing framework for the national adaptation plan plus the provincial adaptation plans. But there's a lot of disconnect between the center and the provinces as of now, that this is not working. We don't even have national legal financial framework for the national adaptation plan. It has its own priorities. Those priorities have been set up with different stakeholders, with the UN system, with development partners, etc. Another important aspect, that yes, we have a lot of opportunities, we have so much potential. Living in this initiative is also one of the biggest adaptation initiatives that the Ministry of Climate Change took with the UN system. But the challenge is that we are not able to harness our own potential, to assess our own capabilities, to even assess how much capacities we have when we are talking about the local finance mechanism. We must not rely on COPs. COP is not a platform that will provide you with access to finance. No, that's not happening. COP is a platform where governments negotiate, and then if some negotiations are successful, they would come up with a draft agreement or a document. Around that document, for the next till the next COP, there will be negotiation, discussion, and it will go on and on. So to be more practical, we need to align our own priorities. We need to have our own adaptation fund, adaptation plan, adaptation financing mechanism. And yes, one of the participants here mentioned about our climate change authority. Yes, climate change authority is a big initiative, and I wish it would have been formed when Climate Change Act was announced. But of course, we as Pakistanis, we are habitual in delaying the actual things that are needed to be done right there and then. So I believe that now there's a lot of awareness. There's lots of things are happening, but still, public sector, private sector are not willing to talk to each other. They're not doing that. Work is being done in silos. If that work is not being integrated, national adaptation planning plus provincial adaptation planning will fail. Yes, we are in a situation of emergency and nothing is working. We are really good with policies and documents, but when it comes to implementation, we are not doing that. And we might show our national adaptation plan at
You're
COP or
absolutely right, Zainab, because ultimately we have to be very vigilant on that account, that we have to make some bodies or the mechanisms with all inclusive, all stakeholders must have to be on board, because it is very important, rather it's the private sector or the public sector, but we have to move forward unitely, because otherwise it would not be and would not going to work. So Zainab, as the United Nations Environmental Program, UNEP estimates, do you think that a developed world will be agreed and the COP29 will attain the success or the access in materializing the adaptation financing need for the developing countries up to at least $415 billion annually by 2030 and 1.7 trillion by 2050, while the loss and damage fund needs at least to top up 580 billion US dollars annually by 2030 and at least 1.7 trillion by 2050. So it is a huge amount and the huge ambitious objective, but unfortunately it seems that negotiations for the negotiation, for the sake of negotiations are going on, but not materialized to its objectives really.
Faisal, let's be practical. I'm really glad you initiate these debates when they're very much needed, and you struggle with these topics throughout the year. It's not just near COP, but you are debating about these topics throughout the year. So hats off to you. But we need to be practical here. For example, I was with a development partner just recently, and we were having these discussions. We know that there are so many regulations globally that we are being bombarded with those regulations, and our trade sector, export imports will be affecting, whether it's EU CBAM, whether it's EU Green Deal, or whether it's USA will be coming up with their own regulations because they want to be climate neutral, right? And maybe China will come with its own regulations. You never know, because of course it's every country's interest to develop its climate adaptation strategies and to promote whatever is climate neutral. um, there will not be anything that you're saying that developed countries will commit to support the financing needs, whether it's adaptation or loss and damage. They would rather make it more complicated for everyone to even understand the process. For example, loss and damage fund, they have involved World Bank. Do you think, as per the definition of low middle income countries and then poor countries, Pakistan and India, we do not qualify the merits under which loss and damage fund can be accessed. How is that justified? This is a matter of climate justice, adaptation fund, and now, interestingly, on every COP they announce new fund. For example, there's very much debate around new collective quantified goal. Let's see what happens around it. But the next year at next COP, there might be a new financing mechanism, because every country loves to announce a new financing mechanism for the world to think about it, struggle about it, and forget about what happened about adaptation fund, loss and
You are
damage.
absolutely
So
right,
this
because
has
it
become
is COP seems to most of the experts say that it is the plethora of lots of jargons rather than and huge piles of the documents rather than to be the practical actions. You are absolutely right on that account. Your point well taken, Dr. Ejaz. Since several COPs organized, as Zainab was rightly saying, and Talha was having the same view, lots of COPs organized and developed world made several verbal pledges, and but funding is very meager, if that is there, and otherwise there is nothing. But sufferings are unprecedented. Most of the countries are waiting for these funds to have adaptation and mitigation, and sincerely, and they have developed those mechanisms, including Pakistan. Here, a couple of questions. Who will contribute these finances? Number one, as developed countries demanding updating the donors list. This is again ridiculous. Include the middle income countries, as Zainab was pointing out, that the higher income, then the middle income, and then the lower one. So they call it that include China, India, oil producing nations, but they are actually opposing now. Now there is a divide, and they might have created that divide, the developed world. Another question is that it will be a loan or aid, as the developing world don't want to burden up with loans because they are already in shackles of lots of billions and trillions of dollars of loans. So how do you see that when we will be sincere with this Mother Earth?
Well, I think we have to look for our own resources, because this story is going to, there is no end to this. As earlier during the discussion it was pointed out that the developed countries are not going to support to that extent.
Means you are talking about some sort of a philanthropy, or might be the charity, which we always do, but why not for climate change?
Or maybe develop a mechanism, in-house, in-country mechanism, where we can generate resources by different methods. There are several ways to raise funds, and generally you just mentioned about the national level contribution, financial contribution. Pakistanis have been identified as most generous.
Definitely, they are always very generous. Whole of the Pakistani nation is very
and
generous.
most of the time, whenever we go through some of the disaster, even out of Pakistan, like
definitely,
in Raza, in many other
in Turkey, even the recent earthquakes
you just
and
name
all
it,
that.
or Iran.
Yes.
So we were the first one to help. So why not help ourselves and generate some resources? Because this debate is going to continue, and it is going to, there will be no positive response as far as I understand. Yes, initially I think it will be good to have some sort of a grant, but with the condition that we will generate our own resources.
Means you are absolutely right in that aspect, that a COP is just like a negotiating table in which you sit at one side and you negotiate. You have just insert some of the practical text, actionable text, and then afterwards having a draft, and till the approval of the draft you will wait for another COP, really. So this is unfortunate mechanism. So Dr. Why governing the carbon market under the Article 6? Because this is very important area of the Paris Agreement, becomes a contentious issue, that there are deep divisions among the participants in the member countries in COP, whether issues like bilateral trade of the carbon credits, right to revoke if the deal violates conditions, or the revocation by involved state, and then the global carbon market overseen by the UN entity, any sort of a United Nations entity. Would that is going to be streamlined, or that is just a heated debate?
Yeah, I think there are concerns in a sense that at some point there were duplication. People were getting the credits from the same like say forest. For maybe like for some from one place, from one agency, and then they were
multiple times from the same source of the carbon credits, and
exactly. So there was
from different organizations
no
or
check
agencies
and balance mechanism. So I think these mechanisms has to be developed, and then based on that, market has to be open market. But ultimately there is a need to have checks and balances. Otherwise, there will be very I don't want to use the word fraud, but then such practices will continue, and then ultimately this whole phenomena, this whole mechanism will fail.
Your point well taken. Talha, during COP28, many countries pledged to triple their renewable energy capacity and double the energy efficiency by 2030, while United Nations urges countries to submit new but more ambitious climate targets by early 2025, and that is right at the corner. Do you think there would be any concrete movement on this during the COP29, and where Pakistan actually stands regarding the energy aspects?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, that Pakistan is going to complete their energy targets by 2030, and we are right on that. The problem lies into INDCs, International Determined Contributions, because the finance is not coming. As my peer mentioned, we need to understand this facility, that how we can harness local finance for the carbon credits. And there is a emission credit system which is present in EU and in the China too, that they can harness their own emissions into those funds, which they can channelize into those areas which are vulnerable into climate science. So NDCs are very valuable, and we are moving towards the provincial subsectoral NDCs, that we are moving towards how we can harness those demand-based targets which we can really achieve. But again, it depends, a lot of it depends upon the international coordinations, because no matter what we do, if the emissions goes high, the more impacts will be biblical, and the maladaptation is very real for us. So we need to be prepared for that too.
Definitely. But definitely those emissions are not in our control, because we are not emitting too much, but we are getting unfortunately a lot. Zainab, how much Pakistan is geared up to have lobbying and the climate diplomacy to attract climate financing from developed countries and the multilateral institutions or organizations, particularly when we are talking about international financial institutions, to implement Pakistan's national adaptation plan and initiatives such as Recharge Pakistan and the projects related to the revitalization of the Indus Basin, such as the initiative took by the former government, like Living Indus and all others. So do you think that Pakistan is moving with the climate diplomacy and geared up with the lobbying system? Because that is very important. And you were mentioning earlier on that COP is actually a negotiating platform, that what is important is that we have to knock the other doors as well. So whether we are geared up for that?
So Faisal, at COPs, it's mostly not the track one, track two diplomacy that's taking place and that's fruitful, especially in context of South Asia. Although that's usually the case for other countries, but for South Asia, I'll be speaking about this region which is least integrated. It's usually the multi-crisis diplomacy that helps. And yes, leaders from both sides, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, other countries, they meet, they sit in different side events, and they talk bilaterally as well on different issues. Think tanks meet, they talk to each other on climate, because we do have an understanding throughout this region that yes, climate change does not recognize borders, but on the political front, there are bilateral meetings, there are negotiations even behind the doors with development partners, with developed countries, and those are the negotiations that later on help us to access some of the investments that are coming in bilaterally. On the other hand, there's also an important aspect attached to it. For example, I believe it was before last year's COP 27 or COP 26, when Global Shield was announced, and through Germany we have been able to access a lot of funds when we're talking about climate and energy. And then after that, with Denmark, so many negotiations were done, and we were able to access finance from Denmark as well. So that's helpful. But on the other hand, negotiations around, where all other partners are involved, like Article 6.2, like carbon markets, like these kind of negotiations, they take some time. And there is a chance, I'm not confirmed, I'm not sure about it, but there is a chance that at COP 29, Pakistan might announce its carbon pricing policy as well. But let's see, let's hope for the best. Or
That's good.
maybe
Your point well taken. Pakistan has to take these initiatives. Dr. Ejaz, very brief because we have run short of time. How much mitigation mechanism and the funding is vital as carbon emissions and the greenhouse gases, especially when we are talking about the trans-boundary pollutants, pushing environmental degradation and creating a worst kind of situation in several regions, including Pakistan, and we are facing right now in the form of smog and all that. So, whether any mechanism available for climate dialogue and diplomacy or imposition of the penalties to the trans-boundary polluters to pay for the mitigation of the environmental degradation in the neighboring nations?
I'm not sure if there is any mechanism, but I think there is no harm in starting initiating the discussion, the dialogues, because they are facing, we are facing. Our communities are, like in a lot of problem. There are health issues, there are economic issues related to smog. So I think this is our problem, and we need to find out solutions. Either by talking to them or by building partnership with those countries which have the technology, which have the know-how, and we should actually start doing it instead of having artificial rain. We should start talking to these bodies, these countries, where we will find the solutions.
Would you like to add what the Ejaz Sahab has said?
Yeah, certainly, because I feel like there is a lot of responsibility lies on us too. The responsibility lies on the oil and gas industry, which is not purifying oil, petrol enough for the cars or for the vehicles in Pakistan, and because of that, that actually adds a lot of number into the smoke
Definitely.
Apart from it, there are other practices of the car culture which we see that the old models, very old models from 1976 or 60s models are still running on the streets. So we need to ban them, and we need to stop those old vehicles entering into urban cities.
And there should be some sort of a
two-wheelers.
Definitely, there should be some sort of a national standards on that, and they are there, but we are actually unfortunately not implementing those. Thank you very much, Talha, for being with us in the studios. Thank you very much, Dr. Ejaz, for here.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zainab, for being with us online and for your candid views. Viewers, you have just listened to our participants, and no doubt that Conference of Parties, this is the 29th one, going to be held in Baku, Azerbaijan, in which the Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif will also be the part of it. Is a very important, it's a hope actually, it's a COP, but it's a hope. Considered the COP of action with ambition, that is important, that we should harness what is actually required. That is the critical funding which is required to the developing countries, the global south, the climate justice. And global south is actually anxiously waiting for the moment when the developed world will realize their climate responsibilities actually. When Paris Agreement, the Global Climate Pact will be implemented in letter and spirit, and the loss and damage fund gets the most needed resources, and adaptation funding become a reality, and so on. Not only we don't have to change the nomenclatures of those funding, but we have to realize our responsibilities and ensure that funding from the developed countries. This is important. Then the COP29 is going to be a successful COP. We hope so, because it is going to be there in Azerbaijan, one of the very friendly and brotherly countries of Pakistan. So we hope that it is going to be a success really. So this is today's Foresight. It's time to sign off. Allah Hafiz.